Today in the Sun newspapers, we have the second part of our series on Quebec equalization, how the rest of Canada shovels billions of dollars to La Belle Province. Well, yesterday I talked to Michel Kelly-Gagnon, the president of the Montreal Economic Institute, about how we can fix this for Quebec's sake. Here's the interview we had yesterday. Michel, yesterday we talked about the numbers that John Robson calculated, showing that over the last 50 years or so, Quebec has been a net recipient of almost $150 billion in transfer payments. But funny enough, Quebec is no further ahead in terms of becoming a have province. Do you think that's actually one of the problems, that Quebec is reliant on transfers from the rest of the country instead of becoming entrepreneurial and looking for wealth in the free market and other places?
Sure, that's part of the problem. Now, mind you, on a per capita basis, it's actually a little bit better than the maritime provinces, but being a little bit better than the maritime provinces is not necessarily a super-duper fee in of itself.
One of the things you and I have talked about before is the untapped oil and gas reserves in Quebec. I mean, I just would find it amazing if Quebec would become an oil and gas powerhouse like Alberta. And if you look at Saskatchewan and Newfoundland, they both turned from have-not provinces to have provinces by tapping into oil and gas. Do you think that solution is possible, or is there too much anti-oil and gas prejudice in the political conversation?
Well, there is an anti-oil prejudice in the political conversation of Quebec for sure, but you can give the right incentives, and I would say a mix of the carrot and the stick. The carrot could be an agreement similar to the one that the federal government did with Newfoundland back then, saying basically, if you develop your oil resources for a while, we will give you a break on the clawbacks of equalization payments. So you can keep most of the money in your pocket as revenue for the province, at least for the first few years. Again, that was a deal that was done with Newfoundland, and we have proposed that a similar deal could be done with Quebec to give an incentive to develop more the oil and gas environment. So that's the carrot. The stick could be that in the calculation of the equalization payments, they would say, we're going to include as part of your wealth the proven reserve that you choose not to exploit. So you're free not to exploit them, but if you do refuse to exploit them, then, you know, I mean, you'll get less equalization money because of that.
Well, let's talk about some of the other ways that Quebec could become a have province again. Oil and gas, to me, is a big one. I mean, it's been a revelation to me just how much shale gas Quebec has and how much offshore oil. What are some of the other industries that, if they were deregulated and maybe if the tax rate was lowered, would really flourish in Quebec and lead to growth so that Quebec wouldn't be reliant on the goodwill of other provinces? What could be some other success stories if the government would just get out of the way, Michel?
Sure. Well, some of the success stories that we've had in the past was the financial sector in Montreal was actually quite strong when you look at it on a per capita basis, a very growing industry. And there were, you know, special tax arrangements that were made at the time to make it advantageous. And some people are saying they want to cancel, you know, those possibilities or those arrangements, tax arrangements. So, you know, financial sector is something we already have, but we should make sure we don't lose it. And similarly with mining, you know, we have a good mining industry, but there has been a lot of conversation right now in the current political discussion to make the tax regime for mining less advantageous than it currently is. So, you know, I'm always for developing new things, but also we must make sure to keep the good things that we have going. And these are two good examples.
Now, Michel, we're taping this conversation before the second leaders' debate in Quebec, but I'm sure you watched the first leaders' debate. Is there any encouraging signs that amongst the leading contenders to be Premier of Quebec that there's an understanding about free market economics and how, in fact, if you reduce the tax rate, you might actually get more tax revenue, or if you get the government out of the way, that will actually help people? Was there any basic economic literacy? Was there any twinkling of hope that you saw in that first leaders' debate?
You know, I'm an eternal optimistic guy, but I have to say no. Not even a glimpse, not even little. It was just hopeless. And it seemed as if none of them were really realizing the fact that the debt of Quebec, if Quebec was an independent country, it would be the 5th highest of the industrialized world, and that the debt of Quebec is increasing at a pace of about $20,000 per minute. And again, it seemed as if, I mean, François Legault, and I'm not making a partisan comment, I'm just making a factual observation. François Legault, in part of the campaign, raised the issue, but during the debates themselves, you know, I mean, he sort of uttered a few words about it, but nothing that would get me really, encourage or feel that there's a broad consensus of wanting to tackle the issue. They want, I mean, I think many politicians in Quebec that are currently running have admitted that the debt of Quebec and the pace to which it's increasing is too high. But then after that, they come up with a whole bunch of promises for new spending.
Now, I love how you pronounce debt. It's almost like you're saying death and debt. And I'm sure that that's not a coincidence, but it's a wonderful way to say debt when you're talking about government. You're right, but even Alberta, which used to be the fiscal exemplar in Canada, has a massive debt. Is there a jurisdiction you can point to, either in Canada, the United States, or even in Europe, left-wing or right-wing, that's managed to get the balance right? I mean, I remember that it was the Labour government in New Zealand that finally brought their fiscal house in order some 20 years ago, just out of sheer desperation. Sir Roger Douglas, the Labour finance minister, said, look, if we don't get off this debt, we're not going to have any social programs. Is there a model you can point to? I'm sure it's not Alberta. We're the worst now. But is there a province you think that's got it right? Is there a state in the U.S. that's got it right?
Well, I would say in relative terms, the federal government, the Canadian federal government, and I'm not making a partisan comment here, I'm including both Martin's and Chrétien's Liberals and more recently the Harper government, who's going back into a better direction. So when you look at it in relative terms, I will participate, for instance, in a series of conferences in Europe in a little while. And, you know, Canada, I'm talking here the federal government, is viewed relatively favorably. And then, of course, I mean, Switzerland is a country that both on the tax front and the debt front is quite reasonable as well. But I think that, at least there's a conversation going, and more people are realizing that it's an issue. And when you talk among ordinary citizens, regardless of their specific political stripes, they do understand that the current path is not sustainable. So I mean, if we want to have a positive light, it's not so much what the politicians say, but what the general public has come to admit and acknowledge.
Michel Kelly-Gagnon, I hope you continue your fight to liberate your fellow Quebecers from the yoke of socialism. Thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you.